Depois de sermos interrompidos pelas feras do Dr. Benny na primeira parte do nosso podcast na semana passada, o Dr. Benny volta a estar conosco para falar sobre o imposto sobre carbono que a União Europeia pretende impor em países em desenvolvimento e as implicações para o Brasil, como devemos nos proteger, o custo financeiro e político dessas medidas extremas, dessas políticas anti-carbono, a força da natureza e se você deve realmente acreditar nas ONGs e uma mensagem de encorajamento para o nosso futuro. Dr. Benny, we were talking about the global carbon tax and what are the implications to Brazil. We know that the EU is planning to impose carbon border tax on emerging countries. What is this, and what will be the implications to Brazil, for instance? Isn't it discriminatory and against the Paris Agreement?
It is both against the Paris Agreement and discriminatory. However, the EU is aware that its radical climate policies will make energy so expensive that many of its industries will become uncompetitive compared to other countries. So they face a real dilemma in that either they introduce these radical policies and make everything more expensive and less competitive, or, and that's the plan, to introduce these carbon border taxes against any country that doesn't adopt the same radical policies. Now, of course, it goes against the whole principle of different responsibilities and different approaches to climate policy, but it's also used to pressurize countries into adopting radical policies. I think we spoke about, what countries like China, India, or Brazil will do to retaliate, because they won't accept that sitting low and just accept that they're more expensive if we export them. So there is a risk of retaliation. And I would think the Europeans have more to lose than to gain, both in terms of political capital as well as economic damage. So I don't really think it's going to work. The risks are just too high. It's more a stick the EU is threatening with, but even the US is worried about the long-term implications of such a protectionist policy.
Yeah, but we have the Climate Leaders Summit yesterday and maybe today, I'm not sure. And the governments were kind of competing for the highest target they were setting. Even the Chinese government apparently said that they will decarbonize by 2060. But do you think it is really true that you get through that? Technically, is it possible?
Yeah, it's possible, but is it realistic? No. It's possible by committing economic suicide. If you look at the energy demand, that is the energy that countries like China, India, or Brazil, or any developed country is expected to have in the next 20, 30 years, energy demand is going through the roof. There are hundreds of millions of new middle-class people in the developing world. These middle-class families have middle-class aspirations. They will have bigger homes. They will need more energy. They will drive a car or even two cars. So energy demand is going up in the developing world, all around the world, apart from the Western world, where it's fairly stable. And to think that you can power these economies without oil and in some cases coal is a utopian pipe dream that is simply not realistic. So even though China says they will peak coal production now by 2026, I think, Xi announced yesterday. So they will still increase coal capacity for another 5 years, and then it will stay very high. They will still emit huge amounts of CO2. Mind you, what President Biden announced, his climate plan, would mean that in the next 15 years, by 2035, the US would have to, because he said he wants to come to net zero in terms of power plants, electricity generation, they would have to close down essentially 1,200 oil, gas and coal-fired power plants, which means the US, as of today, would have to close down 10 power plants, coal or gas, every month from now until 2030. It's not going to happen. So lots of and how do we know it's not going to happen? Because not a single G20 country that has signed up to the Paris Agreement is on target to actually hit the Paris targets. So these are all pledges far into the future when these politicians and leaders are nowhere near government. They'll all be gone, and future leaders will have to pick up the mess that they are left with.
That's the problem. The mess, I think, will be pretty big, and regular people like us will be paying bills, and poor people and poor countries even more, because they will not be able to develop if those policies are implemented. People will die of cold, as in Europe, or of no electricity in Africa and Brazil.
Yeah, you know, most people are not aware that about 700 or 800 million people in Africa haven't even access to electricity. They're not on the grid, right? They don't have 24/7 electricity. So we live in a world where 1 million or more people around the world don't even have a basic access to electricity. And now to tell them they can't really develop the same infrastructure as Europe or the US is just morally unjust and outrageous, really. And in any case, it's unlikely to happen. African nations are currently planning to build more than 1,000 new gas and coal-fired power plants in Africa. Today, they're planning to build 1,000 new power plants. Now, you tell them you can't do that? Are they going to listen to you? They're not even listening to the combined pressure of the US and the EU, because that's what they need. And they will tell the US and the EU, well, you've had 200 years of development. You can't stop us now.
Well, the Brazilian, going back to the climate summit of yesterday, the position of the Brazilian government was to say that we were responsible for something like 1-2% of the global emissions. It's very low comparing to China, for instance, and that we were protecting the Amazon, and that we want to protect the Amazon, but it's a huge area. I think it's even bigger than the whole of Europe, even more than that. So what the government said is that, please send me money that it will help me protect the Amazon if you want. And what happened is that the NGOs and artists and all of them said, no, don't give money to the government, give the money to the NGOs, that we will take care of the Amazon, you know.
Of course, yes, of course. This is the whole game for the NGOs, is a game to make money. It always has been. Scare people and then ask them, look, give us money, we will, make everything good. This is like in the Middle Ages. It's a religion.
Yeah, but I'm really afraid specifically to Brazil, because Brazil has been in the spotlight, especially in relation to Amazon, and with Biden and the green movement picking up and getting stronger and stronger every day. I don't know if in the near future they will try to do something they did with Syria, with an intervention.
Well, you've had a radical left-wing government which messed up. No, that's normal. That's what happens if you have a radical left-wing government. They tend to mess up the economy. The most important thing for Brazil really is to develop and to make sure that families have food on the table and jobs, good jobs, and become a high-tech society, because that's where we're going, and have a good education system, have a good health system, and you need a flourishing economy, and that is the key. If you damage your economy by making things more expensive for people, they will suffer, and that it will. I mean, there's in all likelihood there will be politicians in Brazil who might eventually be voted in, who want them to introduce all these radical policies. But as I said before, once people realize that they are being punished by these policies, they will rethink. And that's what we are seeing already in Europe. People are beginning to get very concerned about the cost and the pain and the burden of these policies for individuals, for families. Here in Britain, for instance, the government now is essentially forcing people to insulate their homes and introduce new heating systems to the tune of roughly £25,000 per home. Now, no one, apart from the very rich, has £25,000 to spend right now to insulate their home. So the problem is, if they don't insulate their home, if they don't spend the money, in about 7 years' time, they won't be able to sell their home, because you will only be allowed to sell your home if it has the right kind of rating, right? Net zero rating. So about 20 million homes still face that threat of their homes becoming unsellable, worthless, essentially. So, these are huge problems. People are just beginning to realize what they're facing. So, personally, I don't think it's going to happen. Personally, I think this whole agenda will crash on contact with reality. And in actual fact, the other realization is that, climate change, which is happening, global warming, which is happening far, far less and far less severe than most scientists predicted. Not only is the warming trend only half, roughly, of what the models predicted, but there's no sign that extreme weather, for instance, is getting worse. There is no indication, and 20, 30, 40 years ago. In fact, the number of people dying from extreme weather events has dropped by almost 95% in the last 100 years. People live in better homes today. We have, either air conditioning, if you can afford it, or, better housing. Not everyone, the poor certainly don't, and they are the ones who are suffering most. So the best way of dealing with climate change for developing countries is to develop and have less poor people, because the people who are less poor can cope with a little bit of drought, rain, or storms, because their houses won't fly away or burn down.
But it's not what happens when we watch television in general. I try to watch with my daughters, I think the documentary on Netflix, I think it's called Our Planet, with David Attenborough, right? And my kids love watching animals and things like that, but they said they couldn't watch. And when we got to the point of the walrus episode, it was so disgusting. And later on, the episode wasn't quite like what they presented to us, because they were telling us that the walrus were killing themselves from the cliffs because of global warming.
That's right.
And
That's
what
right.
they later on discovered was
it's
something else.
Yeah, polar bears were chasing them. Simple. The real scandal was that they knew that, because the footage that emerged later showed that they had filmed the polar bears in the vicinity coming towards the walruses. So that is part of the problem, that most people haven't got the time or the inclinations to actually dig deeper into what they're being told on television and look at the full spectrum, the full context, right? They only see, ooh, there is a wildfire, or there's a flood, or there's drought. They don't look at, okay, let's look at the last 30 years, or let's look at the last 50 years. Are there more wildfires now than there were 50 years ago, right? Because 50 years ago, most people didn't have access to television, never mind the internet. And if something happened somewhere in South America, the Europeans wouldn't even know that something happened in South America. Today, anything that happens in the world is almost immediately reported around the world. And so there's the impression that it's getting worse. But if you look at the long-term trends, if you have the time and you know how to look at the data, the only thing that matters is, do we see more wildfires today? Do we see more floods? Do we see more storms or not? And we've just published a new report yesterday about the state of extreme weather events globally. And there's very little evidence that things are getting worse. It's more or less normal. These events have happened for hundreds of thousands of years. And if you look back at the last 30, 50, 100 years, if at all, if anything we can say is that less people, much, much less people are killed by weather disasters than in previous decades.
And nature is stronger than we think. I work for a project in the shore, and the beaches around São Paulo, where I live, about 60 kilometers, 100 kilometers from where I live. And I was helping make water treatment for some isolated people around an island called Ilhabela. And I went to the museum there, and they had pictures about 100 years ago from the place, from the island. It's the biggest island here. And the island had no trees. It was a farm. And if you go there, you look at it, the nature is exuberant, you can see waterfalls everywhere. It's amazing. And it was only 80 years ago. And I have a house in the countryside here also. And I got a picture 30 years ago from the place I live. And all around the place I lived is a forest right now. But it was a cattle place. And in 30 years, the forest is back.
Of course.
Nature is really strong.
Absolutely. And people forget that as societies grow wealthier, their ecological footprint is actually diminishing, is actually shrinking. We are better at, for instance, at intensive agriculture, uses less land. People don't get that. They think, oh, industrial agriculture is bad. But ecologically speaking, if you do it properly, you reduce the land that is necessary to produce. And so wealth in most developed countries, the forests are growing back, and nature is actually growing, because also people move into the cities. A few hundred years ago, most people lived in the countryside, working as agriculture workers. Nowadays, most people live in cities and work in cities, and of course that diminishes the pressure on nature, on the countryside. And I'm pretty sure the same trend is true for Brazil. Young people from the countryside, they don't want to be farmers anymore. They want to go to have a job in the city. They move into the city. So there are some very positive trends globally on the regreening and the reforestation of the planet. And this is something that is continuing as the developing world becomes more developed.
The agribusiness in Brazil is we are a powerhouse on that. We grow more food in less land every year. We have record crops every year in less land. But if you talk to some people that lives in the city here, and then they don't go to the countryside as I do, and I've been a lot to the countryside and talk to farmers. The farmers are the first one to conserve the forest. They know that they need the forest for their crops, the water that the forest give to them. So it's a kind of, it's a strange war between urban area and rural area.
Of course.
And
Go
ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying that as Brazil develops and becomes a more urban, industrialized society and high-tech society, agriculture becomes less and less important. It is still such an important part. In the US, agriculture up until I think 1950s was a very dominant industry. Now, I think only 5% or even less, 3% of the public works in agriculture. So, because we are getting so much better at producing food, that we need less and less land to do it, and less workers to do it as well. So we're actually doing something right, instead of this, image of we are destroying the planet. A lot of countries are actually moving in the right direction of becoming developed and therefore having the luxury to look after the environment.
All right. Was Prince Philip a climate skeptic?
Yeah, he was. He was quite outspoken about it. Of course, because of his sensitive role in the royal family, he couldn't do it that publicly. And whenever he tried to invite scientists, for instance, to Buckingham Palace to talk about the climate, he was, his advisors would try to stop that because it would be very controversial. So he had a different view to his son, Prince Charles, but he was one of the first and foremost conservationists in the world. He was, and he also, some of his views were not as sound as others. Perhaps on population, he was very concerned. He was a kind of alarmist on global population growth, which turned out to be a false alarm as well, as we now know. But in the 60s, 70s, you remember the population bomb and the scare, the predictions that hundreds of millions would die from starvation, and no one anticipated that we would be overflowing with food. That India food would be rotting in their
cellars,
in their warehouses, because their overproducing and don't know how to manage these huge amounts of food. And that, fat Chinese. I mean, who would have thought about this obesity problem in China?
Here in Brazil also. Yeah,
of course. That's the best indication of a society where there is no food problem anymore, right? Where food is so cheap that you can stuff your face, basically. And that's the reality in most developed or emerging countries. There are still very, very many poor countries and parts of the world, but they're catching up, and partly because we are getting better at agriculture, and so for food production is becoming cheaper, and therefore food is more available. So this whole population problem or scare, which we had for 200 years, is now upside down, because now people say, bloody hell, we're not producing enough children. We're aging. We are, a lot of European countries are actually facing a demographic crisis of not having enough young people. Even China has a similar problem. Never mind Japan, where you have to have robots to
talk to people.
Yeah. So that was the first false alarm from a kind of Thomas Malthus, who had this scientific theory that people would have more children that they could feed. That was his theory. He had a mathematical, and people say here's the mathematical formula. You can't deny that. It's quite obvious. At the time, no one anticipated the pill, contraception. No one anticipated women being educated, having jobs, and having on average, less than 2 children. So because we've had so many false scares and false alarms, and none of these alarms and none of these scares have actually become reality, one has to be skeptical about the latest scares. You have to be taking every prediction with a piece of salt, because we know how environmentalists exaggerate. I don't want to come across as someone who's saying we don't have any problems. Of course we do, but none of the problems we have are that existential or that bad as we see on television.
And human ingenuity is very high. We can deal with these things.
Absolutely.
Dr. Benny, I think we are running out of time. You have other things to do, and I thank you a lot, and would like you to come back if you could. And would like to ask you one last question. What was your favorite part of this podcast?
What was the favorite part of the podcast? Meeting you and talking to you. I've never heard of you, and your invitation came out of the blue, and I'm delighted to see critical voices around the world listening and interested in other opinions rather than the kind of alarmist, exaggerated fear-mongering. And that was a real pleasure. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much.